You're good.
I appreciate you coming out. This is a paper, a rerun, a reprise of a paper I presented, an invited paper I presented at the National Council of Schools and Programs of Professional Psychology. This is a footnote. I'm going to start out with a footnote. I want to thank the research assistants that worked with me on this, Liz Rogers and Kevin O'Leary. And I'd also like to thank graduate students Allie Grudy, who wrote a dissertation on mentoring, and 2004, that was a long time ago. And current students, Tom Huslender, Mark Makor, and Megan Marsh, who commented on earlier versions of this. So there's no real place to do that in the text, so I thought I'd start out with it. In this talk, I'm going to present some personal narratives of interpersonal aspects of mentoring. Having taught cognitive psychology since 1982, it may be no surprise to you. It's like people coming to the door. I already thanked you, Kevin. It may be no surprise to you that I've been strongly influenced by Jerome Bruner. He invented cognitive psychology in the late 1940s with the famous Red Queen of Spades and Black Queen of Hearts experiments. He showed that it was what was in your head that helped you make meanings of things, not just the stimuli and the environment. He was 100 years old last October 15th, and still smarter and more creative than probably all of us in this room. Take a look at his videos online. In the last 25 years or so, he has articulated a narrative creation of self. Is this a problem? Can you hear in the back? Thank you, sir. He's articulated a narrative creation of self. Bruner argues that not only are humans wired for language from almost the beginning, but they're wired for narrative, for stories. All you got to do is hang around with little kids, and you see how quickly that's true. So who am I? Both to myself and to you, is embodied in my stories. So when I do something weird or something unusual happens, I develop a narrative that shows how it makes sense in terms of my local culture and the time it occurred. When I grow, or for that matter, deteriorate, the narrative changes. And the same, of course, is true of our clients. This has something in common with Michael White's work, White and Epson, as you all remember, but it is much more phenomenological, a little less didactic. The point of this is not for you to understand my personal narrative. Instead, it is for me to convey, by this personal ethnography, some thoughts on the interpersonal aspects of mentoring which I have experienced. As I've read for this paper, I have come to see the lack of precision in the term mentoring, or maybe it's just a projective test. It has come to seem more like the general use of the term therapy. Everything developmental can so easily become therapy, or maybe even mentoring is just like friendship. And of course, there are all sorts of friendships. So what am I really talking about is 4 key elements of mentoring. First, mentors show some key aspect of their professional selves to their mentees. Second, mentors communicate some key elements of their professional thinking to their mentees, which those mentees come to adopt. Third, Mentors serve as key role models to their mentees. And fourth, mentees are attracted to some important aspect of the mentor's persona. As I've been obsessing about this paper, I've wondered why I did not include a number of other very competent, very respected supervisors that I had on my list of mentors. Certainly they have done many of the things identified by Johnson and Ridley. Johnson and Ridley wrote the classic book on mentoring that's popular these days. They seem to be in a different category, and somehow I'm less connected to those people. Maybe it is simple. Alexandra Grudy, a student of mine a number of years ago, wrote a dissertation in which she developed the idea of mini mentors. She saw that in professional psychology education, with requirements to change practicum supervisors every year and less emphasis on long-term programmatic research, students made connection for some narrower array of attributes. And that is perfectly reasonable. Another possibility is that mentoring requires a deep sense of connection with some particular element of the mentor's thinking. With each of the people I consider mentors, I felt a deep connection in their interpersonal perspective in the field of psychology. So maybe something comparable to this is a prerequisite. Or maybe I did not allow myself to make the depth of connection with some supervisors that I made with those I considered mentors. Certainly I didn't think of all my dissertation. I don't think of all my dissertation advisees. I don't think they all count me as a mentor, but more about that below. Though it incorporates my personal narratives, the conclusions are nested in the literature, though they will not be my prime focus. I did get to read Johnson and Ridley's great book, which is the best nuts and bolts how to do it book on mentoring right now. The topic will be explored. This topic will be explored through my unique and lucky narrative of being a protege. I had the great good fortune of having 3 mentors. According to Johnson, between 1/2 and 2/3 of graduate students in psychology report having only 1 mentor. Clinical psychology trainees are less likely than students in other specialties to be mentored, and students in PsyD programs report less frequent mentorships than those in PhD programs. Further, this particular good fortune, including having the 3 foremost interpersonal theorists at the time. That's 1960 through the 80s. Clifford H. Swenson at Purdue, who wrote Introduction to Interpersonal Relations, 1973. Bob Carson, Robert C. Carson at Duke, who wrote Interaction, Concepts of Personality in 1969, in a book which has just been reissued in 2009. And Don Peterson from Illinois and later at Rutgers, who wrote The Clinical Study of Social Behavior. Many other articles. They were friends. They got together once a year. I've since been told it was twice a year. And so it was said to talk interpersonal theory. They met in Durham for Duke, and at Champaign for Don, and at Lafayette for where Cliff was. They were friends. I was passed on from my dissertation chair at Swenson at Purdue to my internship at Duke, where Carson was my primary supervisor, and then to a job interview with Peterson at the University of Illinois, which I failed to get. The relationship began again in 1982 when Don was on the Antioch advisory panel. It mellowed during years of connection at NCSPP, and it continued until his death in 2007, 25 years. I'll describe what my experience was with each of them and the 4 areas of mentoring light of Don Peterson's importance to the creation of this ID and 10-CSPP, given the audience for whom this paper was prepared, I'll talk about him and our relationship in detail. He has been a colloquium speaker here, I think, before most of your times. Some of you might have met him. Many of you know that he pretty much invented professional psychology, and with some others brought together the first meeting at CSPP in a ballroom, small ballroom in Canada, 1976. Let me start with Clifford Swenson. Dr. Swenson, for that is who he is in my memory, was a small, scholarly man. None of his students in those days called him by his first name until he graduated. I connected with the literary and scholarly side. He read philosophy and novels besides psychology, as did I. We may have been the only two at Purdue in those days. Now I probably should include my fellow student, Pat DeLeon. Dr. Swenson learned Danish to read Kierkegaard in the original, something I could never personally imagine doing. We talked literature, psychology, and relationships. I felt lucky. I mentioned that I envied the fact that he wasn't a grad student and had all this time to read. He smiled and told me that that really wasn't the way it was. And thinking about how naive I was, I've been on the other side of that interaction since. The key interpersonal moment had to do with the dissolution of my new marriage during the first year of graduate school. At the beginning of my second year, I was pretty seriously depressed. I told Dr. Swenson about it on the phone. Moving way out of character, he came over to my small apartment and sat in the red leather chair that had been a wedding gift. It wasn't so much that I remembered what he said at the time, but that he came. Days later, I was granted a divorce. At that time in Indiana, there was a 6-month waiting period until it became final. I was in Dr. Swenson's office that day, feeling sorry for myself and telling him. His response was in classic interpersonal therapy mode. Are you still worried about that? He didn't reinforce my dysfunctional whining, and I stopped worrying. Well, here are the things I learned from Swenson. There were two key elements of this professional thinking that I adopted and have still to this day used. First, everything is interpersonal and social. All of you here know that about me. This still lives in my preoccupation with Gergen and social constructionism. Second, if you want to know something about people, especially in complex areas, start by asking them. This has evolved such that I still encourage students to do surveys on the internet, as well as collect qualitative data. Dr. Swenson was a role model for me, scholarly, widely read in psychology and beyond. Most of my classmates found him intellectually intimidating and were frightened and avoidant. I was attracted to this part of his persona, and many would say I have adopted it. I sent this paper to Cliff. He's the only one of these three still alive. He's 90 years old. He manages the finances of an old folks community connected with Purdue. And he wrote me back that his wife could not imagine how anyone could be scared of him. And then he sent me, I asked him for what he'd been writing lately, and he sent me a bibliography of 40 papers on neuropsychology. Certainly we became friends, so distance and career differences took us in different directions. He and his wife stayed at our house once when they came out east. My wife and I stayed at their place in West Lafayette once. It was Swenson that urged me to go to Duke on my internship and work with Bob Carson. so next to Bob. Bob Carson was my primary supervisor in my internship at Duke University Medical Center. I met with him a couple hours a week for a year. He was verbally convincing and charismatic. He was viewed as a leader among the psychologists at the medical center and the department at Duke. His book, Interaction, Concepts, and Personality, had just come out and was a Bible for those of us so inclined. The key interpersonal experience I had with him was in joint therapy. His policy was to see a client with his supervisee in the room. He was the best therapist I have ever seen, films included. He was fully and enthusiastically engaged with the couple we saw. He had an hour after each session in which I had the opportunity to ask him questions about why he had done this and why he had said that. To say it was illuminating is to underestimate the huge value of this experience. I wondered why we therapy faculty do not do this more often. I guess we're afraid. Though the fear is disguised as pseudo-psychoanalytic language about privacy and disrupting transference. My father, a university surgeon, found it weird that we did not show our work to students more often. You know, surgeons do it all the time. This was the most valuable therapy learning experience that I ever had. There's more than Carson's shadow in my work even today. So here are the things I learned from Carson. Two key things. First, the more rigid one is, the higher the level of psychopathology. Rigid people are not able to respond to new situations in creative and flexible fashions. Second, bowing to the interpersonal circle from Tim Leary to Isaac, it was a therapist's job not to reinforce the extreme positions in the interpersonal circle. Now to Don Peterson. My relationship with Don Peterson was the longest and most influential mentoring relationship I've had in my life. Don and I met again in 1982. I say again because I first met him during that interview for the job I didn't get at the University of Illinois. He was involved with our program at Antioch, New England as part of the original advisory committee, along with George Stryker, Gordon Gerder, and some of the other luminaries of psychology at the time. That was how I connected with him. He was my late life mentor. You know, you're lucky if you have one mentor in your early life. And you're certainly lucky to come upon someone when you're older, stubborn, and less open-minded, and who will take you under their wing again and help you think things through and help you get some clarity. Our relationship grew during twice-a-year NCSBP meetings. If things developed, he was also my co-conspirator. That is, we planned and wrote stuff together. We talked out the dilemmas of professional psychology as they were appearing in the world. Starting in those years and later, he was my friend. It seems artificial to speak of Don without his wife, Jane. The relationship was also with Jane. Jane was there all the time. She would be involved in many of our conversations, and my wife, Jan, would be as well. He was half of a great love. Jane was the other half. Even as his health declined as part of aging, you could see in their eyes that they truly loved each other. I don't mean that there was never a difficult moment, especially as they both had health problems. I'm not trying to idealize them in some way. I know he could be stubborn and he had a temper. But it's wonderful to see people in later life who get along, who talk to each other, who try to help each other out, and try to be there for each other even in difficult times. The love and care and respect always showed. This was particularly nice for Jan and me and our kids to be with these people because they showed this part of themselves. You know, when you're young, it's hard to imagine that older people have anything to teach you. Or maybe they have a few things, you know, or maybe you don't see sometimes how it is for them to be with one another. You know, for a number of years, they read to one another every morning. Our time together blossomed into a deep friendship. We had a similarity of background, both Midwestern Swedes. We are different generations. Don grew up in a small town in Minnesota, much like where my parents grew up in Illinois. He was surrounded by a whole bunch of those intense, focused, unexpressive Swedes, the people I'm fond of calling blue-eyed fanatics. He grew up in a rural area of Minnesota surrounded by lakes just like a regular kid, swimming and boating and so on. But of course I didn't know him then. I wasn't even born. Before he went to college, my wife tells me I can't cry like this. Before he went to college, he was a soldier in Europe. Imagine the naive Minnesota kid going to become a soldier in the Second World War. And he told the story. Because he could type and was smart, he became an aide to a senior officer. Bring to your mind's eye this small town boy as he sat in a Jeep with that officer. As Americans for the first time opened up .com. This was an experience that marked Don, I think, for the rest of his life. He was astounded and moved by what he saw. He was so far from that Minnesota boy's experience, what humans did to one another. And it was hard for him to believe. Even 10 years later, when he went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., or saw a realistic movie about the war, he was filled with emotion. Sometimes it was frozen. He was frozen in his seat when the lights came up. They sickened him. The sights he saw. He talked with all my family and me at those long and discursive dinners. With other threads, it led to a deeply ingrained sense of how we shouldn't be inhumane to our fellows on the planet, to people different from us. He had a deep and abiding sense of compassion and injustice, something I was lucky enough to get from him. And indeed, his unfinished book was on prejudice. Don was well known for advocating for professional psychology that put the needs of the clients first. In the great debates that he had with Dick McFall in the early 90s, he said it was our job to take the best we had to offer, the best science, the best practice, the best experience, the best compassion, and to put it to use for a particular client whose problems are in front of us. So who was he then? He was a Midwestern Swedish populist who was dedicated to helping real people outside the ivory tower. Don came back from Europe and went to college at the University of Minnesota, ultimately to graduate school. Someone told Don, go talk to this old guy down the hall and find out what it'd be like to major in psychology. That guy turned out to be Paul Meehl. And when you remember, Paul Meehl is one of the two people identified by psychologists as the psychologist of the century in the last century, according to APA. Meehl became Don's lifelong mentor. He had a relationship with Paul that lasted until Paul died. Paul was a person whose expertise was the measurement and philosophy of science, while at the same time he maintained a psychoanalytic practice. his whole life. There's a book on that that includes his handwritten correspondence. Don was a persuasive leader and a visionary. Following key papers in interpersonal research, he almost single-handedly laid the intellectual foundation for doctoral professional psychology and education. Can you imagine what it would be like in 1968 directing the first PsyD program in the country and defending it at the University of Illinois? Can you imagine the load of crap he got and the garage he sustained? He was matter of fact about it, and he was proud to have done it. The PsyD program at the University of Illinois, what was happening was that it was taking longer for those people to get through than the PhD. People, because they had to do both clinical and complex dissertations. He moved to Rutgers, where he was dean then for many years. Don had a burning intellectual intensity that maintained until the very last time I saw him alive that last summer. Well, he was elegant. He was an elegant, clear, and articulate writer, always challenging and thought-provoking. He wrote prose like butter, of the sort that all of us who write academic stuff aspire to. It's much different than this raggedy stuff that we mostly read. I mostly assign what we do. We wrote a paper on the NCSPV model as co-authors. My initial first draft had more red on it than there was black type. I kept threatening to frame it, put it on my wall of my office so that my dissertation students wouldn't feel bad when they're told to fix this or that, showing them that I knew what it was like to be on the receiving end years after my dissertation. It was sophisticated. He read novels. He read history. He and Jane regularly went to Broadway plays. He was outspoken. He was shocking. When I go back and read Don's paper, I find that he has written some of my best ideas 15 years before. Oh well. At least I was in good company. Things I learned from Don. First, Don felt the responsibility for his contribution to the professional psychology movement with great intensity. He had self-doubts. They're okay to have. He was direct and frank. Second, among the key elements of his thinking was that we must clarify, always clarify and clarify again what we are saying and what we are trying to do. One result was that the NCSPP model paper, which all of us here know, had that so much of that red ink on it that my first draft you can hardly see the print. Later I learned we must always show the relationship between the key elements of our thinking. Arguments should start with the phenomena, the clinical phenomena, and the real needs of people. Third, he modeled an openness and a thoroughness of relationship. We would sit at dinner, Don and his wife Jane, myself and my wife Jan, on our New Hampshire porch. They were among Jan's and my favorite dinner companions. Normally they lived near Rutgers in Highland Park, New Jersey. In the summer they came down from the small old schoolhouse in Vermont that they had bought so many years ago. It's on a hill about 1 hour north of here. Among many times over the summers, they were on our porch where we had good food, usually on the grill, drank too much moderate quality wine, talked for hours about books, plays, and of course psychology. They were gracious and attentive to our kids. Part of the best things they had to say through all of those years. Part of the best things that they, through all these years, was that they treated our children as if they were real people with important ideas. They asked them how they were. They were interested in what they were thinking about and what was important to them. Later, when he became seriously ill, at his initiation, we all talked about death and dying, and of what, if anything, happens next. kids really love to have them come. When Don died, fourth, Don focused on the idea that traditional university science had not sufficiently addressed what was happening in the clinical situation. I have a citation here where he develops this idea. The needs of the clients are always first. The field's interest was in better knowledge, not a bad thing, not in helping individuals. Neither the scientists nor the practitioners are the originators of the issue to examine. The clients are. Therefore, professional psychologists should be trained to think scientifically, know how to think, and of course think like psychologists. In a paragraph that sounds up to date, Don thought, quote, each problem must be addressed as it occurs in nature, as an open, living process in all its complexity, often in a political context that requires certain forms of action and prohibits others. He believed that science can be developed to fit practice, and vice versa. He called all of this disciplined inquiry. He's a blood brother of the local clinical scientists that Steve Treeweiler, George Stryker wrote about. Fifth, and maybe I had this already, but Don was a strong spokesperson for equality, 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 equality. Part of this was about the need for psychologists to be talented. We sometimes had conversations about equality chest deep at Spofford Lake where I live. The lake reminded him of his childhood in the Minnesota spring-fed lake. A spring-fed lake means that you're walking around the lake and there are bursts of astoundingly cold water from underneath you. It's not always that much fun, actually. But it reminded him of home and of his childhood. We would talk and maintain a conversation about how a smart person needed to be a clinical psychologist, about how smart a person needed to be a clinical psychologist. You need to be smart in addition to wanting to help people. We know that one does not have to be particularly smart to help people, but maybe you do have to be particularly smart to do what psychologists are involved in doing. We had an obsessively detailed talk about what that might be. Don worried about this. He worried even obsessively about the quality of the programs, about what he had started. There was a time when I was on the American Psychological Association Accreditation Committee. I was depressed about having a particularly weak program quote some of my own work with Don as its rationale. It's an odd feeling to have some of the things that you've thought about and put forth used by others in justification of some of their weak work. And he said that he had that experience all the time, where people quoted his ideas he had written about and things he stated. So what did he do? We decided that we would get together in my office in the summertime and we would have 2 hours of intensive mutual therapy. It was actually pretty successful. There was a good interpersonal connection. I doubt either one of us changed, but we felt better. It was not covered by insurance. Time and happenstance. It's increasingly clear to me how much of these mentoring narratives are the product of timing and happenstance. The relationship with both Swenson and Carson occurred early in my career before my doctorate. The main part of my relationship with Swenson was mostly 4 years long and faded when I worked at a counseling center and then in an academic program. My relationship with Carson was designed for a 1-year internship and didn't continue after that. I lived and worked nowhere near either one. My relationship with Peterson was 25 years long. In the first 5 years, he would have been an interesting colleague I was getting to know. But after a decade, I co-chaired an CSPP conference with him. A few years later, we undertook a public description of the NCSPP professional model. Then we worked together on epistemology for practice for Don's book. The fact that their summer house was an hour from mine was an important and was happenstance. It may be the determination of whether someone was a mentor or not is made retrospectively. That said, my work with my own, hopefully, mentees is just at the beginning. My own mentees. Finally, let me tell you what I try to do with my own mentees. Most of the opportunities for mentoring occur in our dissertation serial system. There's a 2 3/4 hour meeting every few weeks with 2 to 4 students. The key activities are dissertation advice, internship, application development, and academic and professional advisement in the broad sense. What to do with difficult or problematic feedback. The meeting begins with a check-in about how we're feeling about our lives, mostly our academic lives. I check in myself and try to show myself while being relatively discreet. The line in my head between what I share and what I don't is clear in my head, but hard to articulate. I talk about my work, about clinical issues which I'm dealing with in my practice, about dilemmas in our field, and pictures of my grandchildren. I try to be transparent about my clinical work, particularly issues that have come up. In my advanced seminar in gerocyte, I share my work in depth with appropriate identity disguise, of course. I share where I think I goofed and where I think I've done some good work. In this way, I work particularly hard to create an atmosphere of safety. I've talked about this paper and its issues. When I asked them to read this paper, they said, don't leave out the humor. We share many laughs together. I don't tell them about the arguments I've had with my wife, the intimate health concerns and family concerns. I try to be available to really see my students. I try to be forthright and direct. I feel an obligation to try to get my students through. I found that if I seem to understand who they are, I do well at getting them through. I try to help them set the stage for their career. It can work out for each one of them, not what I would have wanted necessarily. I try to teach them some of the things I know, but I'm not sure I can say what actually they are. Maybe they say things I've carried from my own mentors. I need to ask them about that. When I began this paper by describing Bruder's work on narrative, I rather naively and narcissistically imagined that that was a way to frame how Swenson, Carson, and Peterson mentored me. But as one of my current students reminded me, the paper just seemed to stop. The rest of the story is how I fared mentoring others, and more important, how they all did, or are doing. There are many narrative lines here. I see only my own with glimpses of others. This is the most important and personally meaningful work I do. There are more chapters ahead. That's the end of the paper. It's not. When I sent this out, Megan Marsh, one of my current students, she said, you got to tell people that the last day of class, you bring students out and sit in the porch right where those conversations with Don occur. So I'm telling you now. I'd be happy to have reactions or thoughts. Yeah, George.
So I'm thinking about the way, given the importance that you ascribe to mentoring and the effort that you put into it, how much control do you think you have over when it works and when it doesn't?
I'm thinking not much. The line is in a place where I think I do best when I understand what someone needs.
Yeah.
I think that works. But there have certainly been people that I seem to be not quite understanding what they need. And I don't seem to find a way to connect with them. And I don't know, sometime in the process of this paper, I sent out an email to my current dissertation students and I asked whether they thought themselves to be mentors or wanting to be mentored or not mentored. And one of the things that happened is that the third year said they wanted to be mentored, and the fourth year generally said they felt that they were mentored. So it's clear that it takes some time. I think that's another piece of it that I think is relevant. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I could take, my 3 people off the deck of the current students and feel like I can successfully mentor them. I'm not sure that I can do that. I'm not sure anybody could.
Well, I'm thinking about, sometime in my first year or 2 here, I think, you said, we were talking about doctoral research seminar and this seeming randomness of where mentoring relationships evolve out of that versus don't.
Yep.
Or at least not in the same way, right? And what combination of contextual factors have to be present for that type of sort of bloom?
No, I think, there is something randomness. It's whether people are willing to open up, it's whether I see what they need. I think that seems key. And see what they need, sometimes it's interpersonal, sometimes it's intellectual, what they need to do to get the next step of their dissertation done, or get the practicum they want, or find the internship. I don't mean that there's just one answer to that. And the rest of it, what thoughts do the rest of you have?
So, why'd you get into this stuff anyway? Mentoring, was it because you had 2 mentors, one in your doctoral program and one in your internship, or why mentoring, and why has it become so important to you? Maybe you said that, did I miss it?
I thought I did, but maybe it might have been before. I think it's the central academic experience that people come to graduate student in this kind of a profession for. I don't know if it's true in medicine or business, although there are many articles on how it works there as well. And it's because these experiences were really important to me. And I didn't say, I had other ones. I don't know if any of you know the work of Tom Cottle, who was a developmental psychologist and was at Harvard when I was an undergrad. And he took me under his wing and sort of got me into graduate school. And that was a mentoring relationship too. But what I actually remember is, he was connected with Eric Erickson and Bob Coles and all these other people that were important. But what I remember about our relationship is him telling me about his acid experiences, actually. So I don't remember some new intellectual insight from that, but I remember the disclosure. Actually, I remember him saying, I was actually in my hat, that's what he said. My hat was on my foot. Anyway, my point here is to say that the level of connection is not always obvious or predictable. Yeah.
Just some comments being one of your mentees. It was so awesome to hear your development, and I think we come here and just pick up where you are and pick up where we are and forget that you have these great influences and that you're contributing to our development. And I really just appreciated how some things you just couldn't put words to. You know, we all know that something happens when we all meet, and yes, we talk about kind of superficial-ish things about internship and all the things we have to do in the checklist, but it's the manner in which it happens that those are the things we can't put words to. And how I've kind of known how you've impacted me is that when my family hears about anything I'm dealing with, you know, they say, what does Roger think? You know, it's kind of like, I started.
I'd pay them extra for that.
Well, it's working. But yeah, they realize that, you know, when I find my family who's never, you know, they've been here once or twice, they start to feel faith in you and the fact that you're guiding me and helping me contribute, you know, to my decisions about my life and my career. It's like, oh, that's the other thing that's happening that we can't put words to, that my family just picked up on the energy that we have in the room with you. And they know that you're taking care of us, and, you know,
Thank you.
I just really,
Thank you.
really appreciate it.
Means a lot to me. Thank you, Jane. You know, there's a piece I think that I learned from this, which is that I haven't done, and that is how do I keep track of your careers later? You know, so maybe when you're graduating, you're doing some things, we ought to figure out some stuff to continue to do together. Yeah.
I think there's so many ways that people can transmit what they know. And what you've touched on today feels especially important to me, that there's learning from books and films, and there's even being in the room with someone as a student amongst your cohort. But there's something about the intimacy of the mentorship relationship where there's something that's transmitted that is that sort of unnameable quality, and I think it's really valuable and important for the way in which psychology lands inside of a person. I'm not sure exactly how to put words to that beyond that. But.
Good try. That's good. Thank you. Good. Jim.
So one of the things that I found most interesting about your talk, probably because it's the most different from how I approach the DocSem, was the talking about your own scholarship as part of the kind of check-in process with the students. And I just was curious to hear you say a little bit more about what function you think that serves and how that helps with the kind of development of mentoring.
That's interesting. Well, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't talk about it. So I mean, until this moment.
It never occurred to me that I would.
So I mean, I think the way I feel about it is that I think part of that just came from Don. I mean, Don would always talk about what was happening next and what he was thinking about. And during this time, there's a book that's out of print now, but it's basically a compendium of his writing. And so we had many conversations about it, about his stuff, not just about my stuff. And it was true with Swenson too. I had 2 years there. I had seminars in interpersonal psychology, one of which was the chapters of each of his book in preparation. So I always had that modeled. And now I'm going to have to think if there's another way to do this. I don't know. Give it a try.
It seems like a nice invitation to the students to be a partner.
Yeah.
A partner as opposed to we're just there to see what they're up to and try to help them, to actually invite them into things that you're wrangling with, and so
Right.
that seems like a nice thing.
And especially if I'm obsessive about some stuff, it's nice to have their points of view. Yeah.
I just wanted to give some feedback about being one of your mentees and this question.
Yeah.
Is when I thought it was really awesome and felt really, I felt important when you were able to share your mistakes or your papers and ask for our opinion. I feel like it communicated that you value your mentees. We have something that's worth listening to. And that you care. And it creates, it like all plays into this safe space where we're collaborating, you value our opinion, you value us, and it's this mutual relationship where, yeah, I'm super smart and really wise and have a lot to teach you, and you have things that, I can learn from as well. So I thought I really enjoyed that from working and being a mentee of yours.
Thank you. And I actually really feel that way. It never occurred to me there would be some other way. So.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, that I think it helps to foster an energy of openness. That when you bring in openness, it helps to foster that in us and model it, which I think is really helpful.
Thanks. Kevin.
Same. This being like the 5th time I've read or seen you present or talk about this paper. One of the things that is like it really stands out to me that hasn't before for some reason was how these 3 mentors have fit very well with where you were developmentally. And a lot of what you talk about in there is kind of how do they kind of encourage that partnership with where you were currently at in your development as a psychologist and as a student. And just, with Cliff in the first one was talking about the sharing about your interest in the books and all these things that are outside of academia that were important to you, and how that kind of can start to pave the way for you feeling as if you're a person in a relationship with someone. And then all the way up to kind of the end of sharing ideas, the big ideas in the wake, and collaborating on projects and things. How it seems really telling that these are the ones that stand out to you. It seems like they're the ones who kind of fit with you the best. They weren't trying to make you something else or push you or be underneath you or anything.
No, there were sharing. There were. I mean, my relationship with Carson was a little shorter, and was more charismatic him toward me. There are other things here, and I think I'm just adding on to what you say. I don't know if I'm actually responding. But there's the relationship I had with Don was in some ways more personal. There were things that he said that I found out about him that I don't know that I expected to find out. I gave a eulogy in here at Antioch, spoken eulogy about Don when he died. And I sent the recording of that off to Jane. And Jane asked that it be played at his memorial service. And I didn't get that my eulogy was important enough for that. I didn't understand that at the time. And I didn't only understood it later when Stan Messer, who was the dean at Rutgers after Don told me. So there's these other pieces that, and there's these other sort of semi-funny stories. I'm not even sure if I'm responding to you. Don had a sob, and that sob, it was a 91 sob. There was something wrong with it. My advice was that he should consider this a classic car, not actually something that he practically drove. So he didn't mind contributing in fixing things up. And he took that advice. And then there was one time where Jane was following him home, and he stopped at a stoplight and she crashed into the back of the Saab. And She was, of course, embarrassed and humiliated about that. And Don thought about it, and then he thought, maybe it's a relief that I don't have to worry about the stem cover anymore. But I mean, there would be things like that that would happen, you know, that are not psychology mentored, right? Him toward me or vice versa. And I think about you guys who are leaving this year, and how do I think I have not done a particularly good job at keeping in touch. And I'd like to try to do a better job. Yeah.
It sounds like the best kind of mentoring relationships never end.
I think that's right.
Never termination.
Right, and it was very nice when Cliff at 90 wrote me back about this paper. You know. So I mean, yes, I think you're right. Even though we've parted paths and rejoined from time to time, and we still have a parallel way of thinking about things. So I mean, it wasn't like he went this way and I went this way. But I think that's right. Has that been the way it is for you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, my mentor, for a very long time, and wondering where it goes. But professionally, if I go in a different direction, I know that there's a very strong imprint, and there's a very strong narrative inside me that's shared between the two of us.
Yeah.
Where I go.
Other thoughts? Other comments?
One last one, Roger. I just think that throughout my life, I've really sought out mentors and had incredibly valuable experiences because of that. And I think that, going up your quick word, that there's that they kind of transcend time. There's something that's really nice about that. That sometimes I've had a mentor where I see them, every week or every month for a particular reason, and then other times where we make a point to see each other once every 2 years, and that still maintains that connection, and they still stay within my world as very important people that I can always reconnect with, even though our paths have diverged and we're doing different things. And so I think there's something about having a sense of a relationship that can last over time, and it doesn't need to be intended to be the same way.
I think that they live in your mind, right? Yeah. No, I think that's right. I agree. Other last comments? Thank you all for coming, and if you have any thoughts, send them to me. I'd like to hear them. I'm going to try to write this. I don't think I have to figure out whether there's a place that will take this personal narrative